I grew up in a two-story house in a quiet neighborhood in Pennsylvania. It wasn't old or creepy on the outside, but there was always something about the attic that made me uneasy. The attic was only accessible through a thin pull-down ladder in the hallway outside my bedroom. My parents used it mostly for storage, but for some reason, every time that ladder was down, I got this heavy feeling in my chest, like something was up there waiting. One winter, my parents flew to visit my grandparents for a few days. I was 17 at the time, old enough to stay home alone. It was the second night by myself. I remember it vividly. It was freezing outside, completely silent. I just finished watching a movie around 1 a.m. when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from directly above me. The attic. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling. But these weren't creaks. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth. 3 or 4 steps. Pause. Then again. I muted the TV and held my breath. It didn't stop. I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed and slowly stepped into the hallway. The pull-down attic ladder was closed. I stood there, staring at it, while the footsteps continued. I remember thinking, if something's up there, it had to already be inside the house. I dialed my parents, but hung up halfway through. I didn't want to scare them. Then I called my neighbor, a family friend who lived across the street. He said he'd come over. While I waited, the footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence was almost worse. Then, from behind the attic door, I heard a single tap, like a fingernail against wood. My neighbor arrived minutes later. He went up with a flashlight while I held the ladder steady. The attic was empty. No footprints in the dust. No animals. Nothing. I slept with the lights on that night. 2 days later, when my parents came back, my dad decided to check the attic again. This time, he noticed something I hadn't. One of the small attic windows had been pried open from the outside. It led to the roof above the garage. We never found out who or what had been up there. But every winter after that, I'd hear those same footsteps at least once. Always at night. Always when it was silent. I moved out years ago, but sometimes, when I visit, I still glance up at the attic door. And I swear, it feels like something's still waiting. When I was 14, my family moved into a small house in rural Kentucky. It wasn't fancy, but it had a big backyard and enough space for me and my younger brother to finally have our own rooms. My room was at the end of the hallway. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the closet. It was built deep into the wall, with an old wooden folding door that never seemed to close completely. Even when I pushed it shut, a small gap remained, just wide enough for someone to be watching. The first few nights were uneventful. But around the 4th night, I woke up suddenly, for no reason. The house was quiet, except for a faint scratching sound coming from the closet. I froze. It wasn't loud, just soft, irregular scraping, like fingernails on wood. I told myself it was probably a mouse, rolled over and tried to ignore it. But over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Always between 2 and 3 a.m., always from inside that closet. Sometimes scratching, sometimes whisper quiet tapping. And every morning, the closet door would be slightly open, no matter how many times I shut it. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to check. I turned on my bedside lamp, grabbed the metal flashlight my dad kept in the kitchen, and slowly approached the closet. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I yanked the door open Nothing. Just clothes, boxes, and darkness. I was about to close it when I noticed something on the inside wall of the closet. Deep scratch marks in sets of 4, dragging downward. They hadn't been there before. After that, I started sleeping with the closet door wedged shut using a chair. The noises stopped for a while. Then one night, around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang. The chair had been knocked over. The closet door was wide open, and standing in the dark gap was a tall, thin shape. I didn't see a face, just the outline of something humanoid, impossibly still, almost pressed against the inside of the doorway. I screamed. My dad burst into the room seconds later, but the shape was gone. The closet was empty. A week later, we moved my brother into my room and left the closet empty. It became sort of an unspoken rule in the house. Nobody opened that closet after dark. Even years later, when I visited home as an adult, the door was still nailed shut. When I was 19, I rented a small, old house with 2 of my friends near our college campus. It was cheap, and honestly, that should have been the first red flag. The place was built in the 1940s, with creaky floorboards, thin walls, and a strange, cold draft that always seemed to come from the living room floor. One night, about 2 months after moving in, I was alone in the house. My roommates were out of town for the weekend. It was around 1 a.m. when I paused my movie because I thought I heard something. It sounded like a voice, faint, muffled, almost like it was coming from beneath the floorboards. At first, I laughed it off. I thought maybe I was just tired, or maybe a neighbor had their TV on loud. But when I muted everything, the sound was still there, clearer now. It was whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it was steady, like a conversation happening just under the house. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the small wooden hatch in the hallway that led to the crawl space. Cold air hit me in the face. I shone my light inside. It was pitch black, nothing but dirt, wooden beams, and cobwebs. No signs of anyone. I closed it and tried to sleep, but the voice continued on and off all night. The next day, I mentioned it to one of my roommates, Mark. He shrugged and said he'd heard something similar once, but didn't think much of it. A week later, all 3 of us were home when it happened again. This time, the whispering was louder, almost like a chant. We turned off every light and crouched near the hatch. Mark slowly lifted the door, and we all listened. The voice stopped for a second, then whispered, "I see you." We all jumped back. None of us said a word for what felt like minutes. Eventually, we called the landlord, who came by the next morning to check the crawl space. He found nothing. No signs of animals. No footprints, no speakers, nothing. But from that night on, none of us slept in the living room again. We kept that hatch nailed shut and avoided that part of the house after dark. When we moved out months later, the landlord told us the previous tenants had broken their lease early because they didn't like what lived under the floor. When I was a kid, I lived with my family in an old 2-story house that had been in our family for generations. My bedroom was upstairs, at the very end of a narrow hallway. Right across from my room was a tall, antique mirror. The kind with an ornate wooden frame, slightly foggy glass, and a warped reflection that always made me uncomfortable. I never liked that mirror. Even during the day, it felt wrong. I'd catch myself avoiding looking at it whenever I walked by. My parents thought it was funny, but at night, When the hallway light was off, the mirror would reflect only darkness, like a black hole just sitting across from my room. One night, when I was around 13, I woke up to use the bathroom. The house was silent. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced at the mirror. That's when I saw it. Someone was standing behind me in the reflection. I froze. It wasn't a blur, and it wasn't a trick of the light. I could see the outline of a figure standing just behind my right shoulder. My heart started pounding. I spun around instantly, but the hallway was empty. I told myself I was just tired, maybe imagining things, and hurried back to bed. But over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Sometimes it was a tall shadow. Sometimes it looked shorter. And sometimes, when I stared a second longer than I should have, the figure would move. The worst moment came one night when I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I felt something watching me. I turned my head toward the open doorway and saw the mirror from across the hall. There was a face in it, pale, stretched, smiling in a way no human ever could. It wasn't my face. I screamed and ran into my parents' room. When they came back with me, the mirror showed nothing unusual. My dad even turned on all the lights, but the glass just looked old and warped. I refused to sleep in that room after that night. Eventually, my parents covered the mirror with a sheet and later got rid of it entirely. Years later, after we moved, my mom told me something she'd never mentioned before. That mirror had belonged to my great-grandmother, and apparently, after she died, a few family members claimed to have seen her standing in it at night. A few years ago, I rented an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was cheap, quiet, and surrounded by fields. I'd recently gone through a breakup, so I wanted somewhere isolated to clear my head. The house had that typical old country charm, but it also had weird quirks, doors that creaked on their own, windows that let in cold drafts, and at night, it always felt like the house itself was breathing. About 2 weeks after moving in, I started hearing voices at night. At first, I assumed it was my neighbors, but the nearest house was half a mile away. The voices weren't muffled like distant noise. They were inside the walls. It started subtly. I'd be in bed, drifting off to sleep, and I'd hear a faint whispering coming from the wall behind my headboard. I'd turn on the light, press my ear against it, and it would stop. The moment I laid back down and turned the lights off, it would start again. Over the next few nights, the voices became clearer. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It sounded like two people having a conversation, but in a language I couldn't understand. Low, rhythmic, almost like chanting. One night, around 3 a.m., I decided to record it with my phone. I placed it against the wall, turned off the lights, and waited. Sure enough, the whispering started again. I let it record for about a minute, then turned on the light to check. What I heard made my stomach drop. On the recording, the voices suddenly stopped mid-sentence, and a third voice, much louder and clearer, spoke directly into the mic. "Get out!" It wasn't a whisper. It was a deep, guttural voice, like it came from right beside the phone. I packed a bag that night and slept in my car. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him something was wrong with the house. His response chilled me. "You heard them too, huh?" He went on to explain that previous tenants had reported the same thing. Voices from inside the walls. Some believed it was the house settling. Others thought it was something else. I didn't stick around to find out. I broke the lease and left a few days later.